Right, so now we move to our last speaker, who is Marwan Darweish. So I'll hand over to you, Marwan.
Thank you, Nathalie, and thank you for the speakers. I think you just laid sort of the foundation for me to argue why popular protest is so important in Palestinian history. So I want to focus on my talk on the Palestinian non-violent popular protest. Particularly, I want to highlight the agency that we have and not just, perceived as a victim. So the previous speakers pretty good highlighted the imbalance of power between the Palestinians and Israel as a colonial occupying settler regime. It is within this context of asymmetry of power I will be talking about the Palestinian popular protest or Palestinian resistance. And to change this asymmetry, it is important to us understand also to look critically and identify what holds the power. So it is important to really recognize that identifying the pillars of support that Israel enjoys and try to undermine it. It is important to raise the economic and political costs of Israeli regime, both nationally and internationally, and mobilize for collective non-violent resistance and refuse the cooperation and keep the status quo. To shame the power, those who are imposing on us, and I would go further to say to transform the oppressor, the Israeli society, and win more section of this society. I want to highlight three main categories of the Palestinian resistance to say that there are the offensive type, which is the demonstrations, the marches, the protests, the boycott goods, the other symbolic activities. The defensive category, which is to enhance the resilience, the lobbying, the documentation, human rights work, the work for academics, etc. And I would say protection, the lobbying, the accompaniment of people who goes to Palestine, and then the constructive side, which is to build economic and social alternatives to the occupation. So now I want to move to I want to highlight the main junctions of resistance, just to give you the idea that we have been for more than 100 years in this journey. So the Palestinian resistance to the Zionist immigration from 1880 to 1948. Briefly to say that this including the Palestinian protests against immigration under the Ottomans and the British after that. Another turning point was the 1930 to 36, which is where the unrest increased and confrontation with Zionist immigration, which is culminated in the first Palestinian uprising in 1936, which was brutally oppressed by the British colonial power. The general strike lasted for 6 months. The last strike, month ago, which included all Palestinians from all of Palestine and outside, being compared to the 1936 strike, which is, in a way, it is really amazing to describe what we living now to something similar we witnessed in 1936. So this has included the resistance of the Palestinians to the Balfour Declaration, which denied their rights. And then I want to look briefly to say in 1948 that the Nakba, where the majority of the Palestinians were expelled, forced out of their homeland, and only 10% of the Palestinians remained in their homeland to become citizen quote, in Israel, Palestinian, which the Palestinians inside Israel, which is my family, from those who managed to stay inside Israel. Immediately after that, Israel imposed military rule was imposed on the Palestinians from 48 to 66. And to give you a sense, what does that meant, that to travel, you needed a permit from your locality. To travel, you needed a permit to work, to study, to medical treatment, or any other reason outside your village or town. This community led quiet, everyday resistance to stay on their land and cultivate it. They led the cultural resistance, which some of you just quoted, like Mahmoud Darweish, Samih Al-Qasim, Tawfiq Zayyad. I am doing research about the role of folk singers between 48 and 66, how they utilize wedding as a space and a place to resist the military rule. After that, we witnessed in the 60s the emergence of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which led the Palestinian national struggle. The occupation of the West Bank in 1967 made Israel now control the whole historic of Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is created, particularly in the West Bank, emergence of new leadership that built a new civil society, grassroots resistance organization, cultural resistance, agriculture and health, that all of it was focusing on the resistance and mobilization to the occupation. The Palestinian political shift of power started to move from outside, particularly in Lebanon and Tunis, to inside to the occupied Palestinian territory. And in a way, the ground being built, the foundation being built to the first Palestinian uprising in 1987. Now, uprising or intifada in Arabic, it means to shake off, to get rid of. And this was the outbreak of the uprising, came as a surprise to many people in Israel and in the Palestinian leadership outside. I want to try and answer what was the significance of the intifada or the uprising. It created a united national command or leadership. Mainly was decentralized and people were free to operate. Was horizontal escalation of the struggle. Every village, every town, every refugee camp joined at all levels of society in mass civil resistance and involvement. And popular committees were formed in all localities to provide services and create alternative bodies to the occupation. This created cohesion, created through these committees. Given that we're talking about universities and students, universities and schools were closed for a long time of period, and alternative education committees were formed. I was in Gaza during the uprising, and I witnessed how lecturers and students will meet in private homes to provide opportunity for students to continue their education. The Intifada was predominantly secular in its nature, and it had a vision to influence also the Israeli public. What was most significant about it is the international support and solidarity. The other junction I would like to highlight is the separation wall or the building of the apartheid wall and the pre-emergence of popular protests in 2002, 2003. So the wall that been built had an impact on the lives of tens of thousands of Palestinians who, sorry, that's my 10 minutes. I'm typing myself. So that's what had an impact on their life in almost every area, from reaching their land, land is being confiscated, they're forced to travel miles and negotiate checkpoints to get to schools, to university, to medical centers. So, but what was different about this period, that it was localized, that it was, say, if it was in the north, in Jenin, it started there, it ended there, and when the wall continued to be built in other areas, the resistance moved, but it was not simultaneously in different places. Let me just say to the current 10 years that the focus of the popular protest was in Area C. And it's also mostly, I would say, with young people, youth, which is in Area C because the Israel in Area C trying to ethnically cleanse the population, particularly from the Jordan Valley and South Hebron. And the resistance focused on preventing such an attempt and the expansion of settlement. Let me conclude to say that the Palestinian alone cannot change this asymmetry of power. Therefore, the important role of international solidarity, international movement is critical. The Palestinian Civil Society Organization in 2005 called for a wide boycott, divestment, and sanction, the BDS campaign, and solidarity. I see this as a source of hope, and that this will feed into the Palestinian protest and the vice versa. What's happening in Palestine will feed into this, this international campaign, which will exercise more leverage on the holders of powers to exercise leverage in Israel to stop its occupation. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss, to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Marwan. That was so rich.